The focus really of much of the debate at the moment is that the third great change occurs in 1977 with the global adoption of the US dietary goals for Americans, which produced the modern industrial food or Western diets. And it's really important that we should take a pause for a few minutes and look at the origins of the science behind this great change. Because this was a dietary change that told us fat was bad for you and we had to remove it from the diet. And unfortunately, what no one told us was that when you take something out of the diet, you replace it with something else. And the fact that the food stuff that we replaced the fat with was carbohydrate. And no one had ever asked the question, what happens if you replace fat with carbohydrate in the diet? So Ancel Keys is unfortunately the person who must take the blame for making us change our diets in 1977. And in 1953, he decided, almost personally, that fat in the diet caused heart disease, and it became his mission for the rest of his life. And the data he presented was from 6 countries in which he showed that there was a relationship between the percentage calories from fat in the diet and the rates of heart disease in those countries. And essentially what he said was that people in America die from heart disease because they eat more fat than the Japanese who eat much less fat and who have lower rates of heart disease. Now the problem with these data are that they come from an association or observational study. In other words, the assumption is that because you notice 2 variables related, that they must be causally related. Now, it's terribly important to make the point that associational studies prove absolutely nothing. They do not prove that the one factor causes the other. For example, to prove that heart disease is caused by too much fat in the diet, what you'd have to do is take a population of Japanese and make them eat more fat and see what happens to their heart disease rates. In fact, the Japanese are eating more fat and their rates of stroke are coming down because they have much more higher rates of stroke than heart disease. And so in fact, their health is going up as they're eating more fat. And in the United States, you'd have to take a person or a group of people and reduce their fat intake and see what happens. And that has been done, and we'll show you the disappointing results. When you take Americans and you put them on a low-fat diet, you find that essentially nothing happens, as I will show you. So the point is that associational studies prove nothing, yet even today, people will tell you that Keys in 1953 proved unequivocally that fat in the diet causes blood cholesterol concentrations to rise, which then causes heart disease. And that is nonsense. Now, one of Keys' most strong opponents was a guy called John Ydkin, a professor in London. And Ydkin wrote this famous book in the 1970s, Pure, White and Deadly, and of course he was referring to sugar. And this book has just been re-released as a classic. And Ydkin was demonized for taking on the sugar industry. And in fact, all his funding was cut and he lost his position, but he took to writing books, which only now, of course, people realizing how very good those books were. And what Ydkin did was he went and looked at the sugar intake and the heart disease mortality in the 15 of the countries that Keys should have looked at. And what he showed was that there was a much better relationship between sugar intake and heart disease mortality in those 15 countries than there was between fat intake. And he challenged Keys and said, but how do you know it's not sugar? And Keys said, we know it's fat. It's not sugar, it's fat. And of course that can't be so because you can't just ignore one variable. And so sugar was put under the radar, and it's really only through the work of Dr. Robert Lustig at the moment that sugar is again being seen as not such a good substance. The blue dots in this graph show the 16 additional countries that were ignored by Keys. So Keys had data for all these countries, but he ignored it because if he'd added all those 22 countries, the graph doesn't look as great as it did with his 6 selected countries. So Keys is responsible for self-selecting the data that best fitted his hypothesis and ignoring the data that didn't agree with it. But a very famous paper, and it's referenced there, by Jerusalemi and Hilibo, published in 1957, went very carefully into all 22 countries that Keys had the data for but had ignored. And they concluded the following, that the evidence from those countries for which data are available indicate that the association between the percentage of fat calories available for consumption in the national diets and mortality from atherosclerotic and degenerative heart disease is not valid. Is not valid. The association is specific neither for dietary fat nor for heart disease mortality. Clearly, this tenuous association cannot serve as much support for the hypothesis, which implicates fat as an etiological factor in arteriosclerotic and degenerative heart disease. Now, this paper is very difficult to get hold of, and so it's completely ignored. But here were the scientists looking at Keys' data and saying, but you proved nothing. But unfortunately, that wasn't good enough, because the next thing that happened was that the US Senate Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs met between 1968 and 1977, and under the leadership of Senator McGovern, shown here on the right, they decided to change the eating behaviors, just not of Americans, but of the entire world. And they released their statement in 1977 saying that we had to reduce our consumption of fat, we had to switch from saturated fat to vegetable fats, we had to reduce cholesterol to 1 egg per day, and we should eat more carbohydrates, especially grains. Now, all those 4 pieces of advice are disastrous, and as we will see, they've had very, very tragic consequences. But the reality is that they were drawn up by a junior staffer, Nick Morton, who was a vegetarian at the time, and who had no training in nutritional sciences. So he interviewed a few scientists, and they came up with these guidelines. And they were tragic, as we will see, but not everyone agreed with them. And Philip Handler, who was head of the National Academy of Sciences at the time, said, "What right is the federal government to propose that the American people conduct a vast nutritional experiment with themselves as subjects on the strength of so very little evidence?" And there's also published evidence that most of the scientists, the nutrition scientists who were asked for their opinion, they said, but there's no evidence that we should change our diets. And they warned the US government against doing it, but unfortunately that warning fell on deaf ears. Another famous scientist of the time, Dr. Ahrens, who was one of the leading cholesterol researchers at the time, pointed out that it seems that the proponents of this dietary change are willing to advocate an untested diet to the nation on the basis of suggestive evidence obtained in tests of a different diet. The point he made was that the diet had never been tested. No one had ever worked out what happens if you reduce fat from the diet and increase the carbohydrate content. What happens to heart disease rates and what happens to other diseases. So there was no evidence whatsoever on which to base this dietary change. It was just assumed that taking fat out the diet would be good for people because Keys had showed that fat was bad food. If Ancel Keys was alive today and he looked at the data from all the European countries, this is the data that he would find. He would see that the countries with the highest total energy intake from saturated fat have the lowest incidence of heart disease. In contrast, countries like Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus have high rates of heart disease and low rates of saturated fat intake. So here we have an inverse relationship. Now, if Keys was around, he would then have to say, well, saturated fat prevents heart disease. And I'm not going to say that. I would say that perhaps saturated fat may be healthy and may reduce the risk of heart disease. But I suspect that the people in Belarus and Ukraine and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan are actually eating too much of the refined carbohydrates, too much sugar, and too much vegetable oils, and that might be the cause of the high rates of heart disease, rather than the fact that they're not eating saturated fat. We've got to see what are they eating instead of the saturated fat that is causing them to have heart disease. For years, people have spoken about the French paradox, that French people have a high rate of saturated fat intake but low rates of heart disease. And they've said it's well obviously because the French drink lots of red wine. What this slide shows is that it's not a French paradox, it's a European paradox. And it's not a paradox at all. Because if you have a high rate of saturated fat intake, clearly you have some reduced incidence of heart disease. And that's what we should accept as the norm, not as the paradox. There's also now good science, and this is a meta-analysis published in 2010, which shows that during a follow-up of 347,000 subjects whose diet was known and they were followed for many, many years, when it was looked at what was the relationship to their historical diet and whether or not they had heart disease, there was no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with increased risk of heart disease or cardiovascular disease. So we can't ignore that because that's what the best evidence suggests. So if you are told that the dietary saturated fat that you're eating today is going to kill you in 30 years' time, that is not what the science shows. And we have to now tell people that that is the dietary truth. But those are associational studies which we've mentioned are not ideal. The better studies are the intervention trials and the Cochrane collaboration, which is known to be completely independent. Their most recent analysis shows that there was no clear effect of dietary fat changes on total mortality or cardiovascular mortality. In other words, in intervention trials where people reduced their fat intake, there was no effect on their mortality or cardiovascular mortality. So again, this provides intervention studies showing that there is no link between changing your diet and your incidence of heart disease. But we should have known that all along because Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, who's a general practitioner in the United Kingdom and who wrote a book called The Great Cholesterol Con, he said, how can eating saturated fat raise LDL cholesterol levels? And LDL cholesterol is usually considered the cause of heart disease. It's not merely biologically implausible, it's biologically impossible. So eating saturated fat cannot be linked directly to raising LDL cholesterol. So Keys' hypothesis should have been thrown out in the 1950s if anyone had understood the biochemistry, that LDL cholesterol is not determined by how much saturated fat you have in the diet. If we now look at this epidemiological evidence and take it a step further, now we go and look at 171 countries where the World Health Organization has reported their data. We see that in countries with low blood cholesterol concentrations, and they're on the left side of the graph, they have higher rates of heart disease than countries on the right of the graph, which have higher blood cholesterol concentrations and lower rates of heart disease. So that's the opposite of what we've been told to be the truth. Now, epidemiological evidence doesn't tell us what the reality is for individuals, but the point is that if high cholesterol diets and high blood cholesterol concentrations were causing heart disease in countries, we should be able to see it, and we don't. And that is the data for the women, but for the men, the total mortality shows the same, that the higher the cholesterol in the blood in the country, the lower the all-cause mortality. Again, the opposite of what we've been told should be the truth.